Yep, okay, it's recording.
Please state your name for the camera. Full name.
Dr. Julie Marshall.
Middle name, any?
Goodman was my maiden name, yes.
Yes. So we need to start with social class. Class identity is strongly correlated with income. It also shaped by a person's values and attitudes. Many people with low incomes adhere to middle class values, and conversely, many with middle class incomes never lost their working class agrarian identity. Start with the basics. What was your subject parent's socioeconomic level, and did this change for your subject over the course of his or her adult life? So when you were a child, what were your parents doing?
When I was a child, my mother was a stay-at-home mom.
Okay, that's we were all supposed to talk about gender norms, so that kind of stuff, and that would have been a gender norm of the time. So
Okay.
Mom was stay at home. All right. And how about your father?
My dad worked for Southern Railway.
Oh.
He was in business, so he was in the more of a white-collar position.
Oh, so he wasn't a laborer.
He was not a laborer.
That's very interesting.
Daddy started with them when he had a 2-year associate's degree.
2 years. So he had a college education.
Yes, because he had gone to, in Savannah at that time, in Savannah, Georgia, they had, their high schools were actually divided. You had the high school for business students, and you had a high school for everybody else. The business students then tracked automatically to the technical school that was in Savannah at that time, which is now a 4-year institution. It was Armstrong. And he went through that 2-year technical program with general business skills, more like office skills.
Okay.
He was in the military and served in Korea as a teletype operator. Again, using those business skills. So when he came out of the military, Central of Georgia, who later bought Southern later brought Central of Georgia out, Central of Georgia hired him as a vet. So
Okay.
that's really where he got more of his training than anywhere, was through the Army.
Okay. Most training from Army.
Mm-hmm.
Great stuff. I love this. So, if you don't mind me asking, how much did your family make?
I have no clue. I know that it wasn't until I was in the 6th grade that they were able to buy a house. We rented the whole time up until that point. It was at that, we moved a lot. We moved every 5 years. We were in Savannah for 5 years. Then Daddy got transferred to Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati, we stayed 5 years renting a house there. And then we were transferred to Chattanooga, Tennessee. That was the first house we bought. 5 years later, we were moved to Savannah, Georgia again for 2 years, and then moved to Rock Hill.
Okay. Wants me to know how much, what kind of work did you do? I don't know if they mean when you were a child, if you did any, or when you first started working, but let's just get the job aspect on.
I did not work until I was until we moved to Rock Hill. We moved to Rock Hill when I was a sophomore in high school. I went to Rock Hill High. I worked during the school year at Belk Department Store selling shoes in the shoe department.
Worked at Belk's.
And then in the summer, I worked at Toddler House Nursery because I loved kids.
Was that a name, or is that what it was called?
That's what it was called,
Okay.
Toddler House Nursery. I don't even know that it exists anymore.
All right. I think we're going to get on to the later jobs later. I think
Okay.
this is starting off. So, what social class did you identify with strongly the most? Like, what middle class, lower middle class, all that.
I think I was probably I was so clueless. I think maybe lower middle to middle.
Okay, so
We didn't have a lot of money.
but
We didn't have a
you
lot
didn't
of
have
wealth.
to. You didn't starve. You didn't.
But I wasn't, no.
You had clothes. You
I had
had the
clothes. Mm-hmm.
basic necessities. Did you? Well, I asked later, but appliances. Did you guys have ovens, stoves,
Mm-hmm.
TVs, radios? Okay, so I think he said that's like starting to show more middle class out of lower middle class when you can start to afford these things. But that was when people were able to like buy stuff on credit for cheaper instead of. But that's later.
My daddy never bought anything on credit,
Oh.
and that's why it's hard for me to know where we fit exactly. Daddy was he was very budget minded.
Okay.
We lived very thriftily.
Yeah. Yes.
Our needs were taken care of.
Yes.
Our wants were a different story.
But now, would you consider refrigerator and an oven and stove all that a need at the time? Or?
At that time, it would have been a need. Now, we never had top of the line anything. We had very basic, but we had.
But you had it.
But we had.
You had a TV.
We had one car.
One car?
That
Okay.
everybody shared. It was an old car.
I think he said that was the norm for
Mm-hmm.
like if the mom had to have a car, then you would have bought it on credit, and it would have been you needed it badly if you would have bought it. Okay.
We used the bus because we had a bus system where we were. And I remember it was a nickel to ride the bus, so we would get on the bus and ride where we needed to go.
Only a nickel.
Only a nickel. Isn't that something?
And I have to plug that into an inflation calculator. Oh, I'm sorry. What year were you born?
59.
Year born. That would have been at the start of the Korean War? Or what would have that been?
That would have been...
I get iffy.
That would have
during this
been...
time.
No, it would have been over. I'm in the civil rights movement is where I am.
When you were born? Or when you were alive?
Just after. I would have been, I think let's see, Birmingham would have come right after this. Kennedy was assassinated, I remember that in 64, I think,
You were
63.
5, and you remember that?
I remember, vividly. I have very, very vivid memories. We had gone to a drive-in. Drive-in, like Sonic, drive-ins were big back then. And my mom had the car that day. And it was a big, that's why I remember it so vividly. We had taken Daddy to work. It was a special day. Mom was going to take us to the Triple X, which was the name of the drive-in in Savannah, Georgia, for a milkshake. And that was a
special
big,
treat.
big treat, because we never did this. When we pulled up to the Triple X, the lady came out to wait on us, and she said, she was just all upset, and my mom said, "Is everything okay?" And the lady said, "You don't know then, President Kennedy has just been shot." And I remember everything just stopping. And we were sitting in the car, and my mother was crying. The lady that was waiting on us was crying. My mom, at that point, my sister had not been born, so it was just me. And my mom, I remember her saying, and I don't know why, but I just remember her saying, "The world is getting ready to end."
Wow.
We left the Triple X. We did not get a milkshake. We went home, and I can remember kneeling down beside our bed and praying for the country. And it was I don't remember anything else from that time period. Right in that area, I couldn't tell you anything else that
But
happened.
you remember JFK's
But I
assassination?
remember that assassination like it was yesterday, because it was just devastating. And I remember we had just a little black and white TV in our house at that time. And I remember, no, we did not. That was Martin Luther King. We did not have a TV at that time. We had a radio. And I remember us sitting by the radio and just listening for everything. That is weird. I hadn't thought about that in a long time. Okay.
you going through this social class, did that change over your life?
Yes. As Daddy moved up at the railroad, we acquired more
Material goods?
I can remember after it was later. My sister was born in 65, I think. No, 64. She's 5 years. Okay, she was born in 64. No, she was 65. I'm sorry, 6 years. Okay, she was born in 65. And I remember we still did not have but one car. We were in Cincinnati by that time, living across the river in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky. A vivid memory there was, I can remember Daddy, when my sister, right before my sister was born, my mom had a hard time with that pregnancy. And she had been in and out of bed. And we had no family around. I remember Daddy taking me to see Mary Poppins at the movie theater, which was, again, another huge deal because we didn't do those things. And I associated my sister's birth with going to see Mary Poppins. So I thought Kelly's birth was just tremendous because I got to go see Mary Poppins. Go figure that one out.
That's little kids.
That's little kids. But I do remember that.
Let's put that. Rarely got treats.
Rarely.
I eat milkshakes and movies.
There you go.
This is good stuff. I like this.
Isn't that something?
It's so interesting how much history every person has.
You
Every
don't
person
think that.
has 7 billion people, and everybody has their own personal history.
Yeah.
And it's just insane. I think I never would have got to experience this with you if I hadn't have met you and had your class and had
This is so cool because these are things I haven't even thought about
for years.
for years, which I always tell students, record your own history so your children will have that when you're not here. And I haven't done it. This is cool.
This is your legacy.
Yeah,
right
this
here.
is it.
Did you experience, now, he said if some of these, they don't apply, just go on. If they can't tell you about it, just go on. It's not a big deal. Because there's so much other stuff to fill it in. Did you experience the Great Depression at all, or did it affect your parents?
My parents talked about it, but
Did you have any?
I think that's probably why there were sometimes
So-
we told Daddy he was tight. But I think that's probably why he had such a save mentality.
Dad was so, what's the word?
Tight.
That's very informal. I'll switch that out later.
Yeah, it is too informal.
This is a formal paper. Dad was so tight, that sounds odd.
Savings conscious.
Because of, the best word would be miserly.
Miserly, there you
Put
go.
that, miserly. Because of the Great Depression. But you said they didn't really talk about it. They talked about it, but you remember much
They
about
just
it?
tried to instill in me the importance of saving for a rainy day.
And not
because you
wasting.
never knew, and not wasting, that even with food on our plate, I can remember Daddy saying, there's so many starving children in China. And
It's everybody. That's everybody.
I think it's everybody. I don't think it matters
Oh,
because I
okay.
turned around and used the same thing. There are starving children in India,
In Africa.
in Africa.
Yep.
Depends on which generation you are.
Mom said Africa. That's really weird too, isn't it?
Funny, isn't that funny how it adapted?
Great grandparent generation said China. Your generation said India. My parents' generation said
Africa. That is cool. That's really cool.
That's a nice little anecdote.
That's a
right there.
nice little thing to
I'll put that.
Yes.
What about the economic expansion during World War II that continued with some downturns through the early 1970s? Did you guys experience any of those upward swings of economic? Because after World War II, our economy boomed because of we were the only country that really didn't lose much per se in terms of, we weren't devastated like Europe. Did you notice any of those effects?
No, because see, I'm Vietnam. Now I can talk to you about Vietnam. I know nothing about any of the effects of World War II.
All right. What about the economic malaise of the 1970s and the expansion? So that would be the oil and energy crisis of Jimmy Carter. Gas rations and stamps.
Okay, So this is real interesting because now you're getting more into what I would say my current day life.
This is what you could.
Very, I graduated from high school in 77. So I remember the gas rationing. I was in college. I graduated from college in 1980. I remember gas rationing. I remember carpooling a lot. I lived maybe a 10-minute walk from my high school. Rock Hill High was where Sullivan actually is now, in Rock Hill. And a friend of mine who lived in our neighborhood had a car, and that was a big deal because nobody our age
In
had
your
cars.
high school?
In my high school. In fact, there were so few cars in our high school, they all fit in. Sullivan is the school that's over there by Cherry Park. All of the student parking was in the small lot right next to the front of the school. And that was the entire student park. You could put maybe 50 cars there.
And that was.
The whole
And how
student
big
park.
was your school's population, if you could estimate?
I'm thinking we had 500 graduates.
Oh,
Maybe.
So about 1 in 10 had a car.
Very few, yes.
As compared to a lot
Yes.
higher nowadays. Okay.
So she would pick up everybody in the neighborhood. There were like 4 of us. And she'd come pick me up first because I was her bestie. And then we would ride and pick up the others. And because I was her bestie, I got to ride in the front seat with her.
Oh.
I mean, that was big stuff. And
What
she
kind
put
of car was it?
It-
Do you remember?
It was a Ford Maverick.
Oh.
Yeah. It was a Ford Maverick. Nothing fancy. And it
But
was
it was
an
a
old
car.
Maverick.
But it was a car.
It was a car.
And not many people could say they had
And
one.
we used to ride, this was how times had changed. Remember, as a child, it was a big deal for me to go somewhere and get treats. Okay, this is not anything I'm proud of, but we were on the yearbook staff, so we had the end of the day planning, or not planning, study hall for yearbook staff. So we had this great advisor, and we would go up and we'd meet with the yearbook staff, and we would leave to take pictures and photographs around the school, and we would get in her car and drive down to McDonald's and get a cherry pie and drive back to school and keep taking pictures, and nobody ever knew we had gone. So that was just kind of craziness.
So now it's asking the expansion of the 80s and 90s during the Reagan era.
Yes.
Reagan the Bush era.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Were you a supporter of Reagan?
Yes. Yes. Reaganomics. And it
Yes, sir.
the whole thing with Reagan was he brought so much hope. He was so charismatic.
Everybody says that.
Oh, he was so charismatic. I got to see
Movie
him in
star.
person.
Did
Yes.
you?
Oh, yes.
Please explain that. That would be great to put.
It was just, I saw him at a rally, because I was real politically active.
Were you?
Um,
That's actually odd. I want to make a note of that.
I was very politically active. I had worked on several campaigns in high school and college. Saw Gerald Ford flew in by helicopter to the old Rock Hill Mall parking lot, which is now Publix, where Publix and all that area is. Landed by helicopter. I got to shake his hand. I was one of the first people that were there. Because at that point, this is embarrassing, at that point I was a Nixon supporter. That was before Nixon went south.
Obviously.
I didn't know a whole lot about Nixon because I was just starting to dabble in politics, and I was being influenced by my parents,
Okay.
who were ultra-conservative.
Okay.
So I did get to see him. That was incredible. That was back in the day when they truly were the people's officials. When they weren't quite, they had 1 or 2 security with them, but nothing like what we see today. And you could get to them, you could touch them, they were holding babies.
That was
they
even
were,
after JFK was assassinated.
even after JFK.
Still had small security detail.
Still very small.
That's interesting.
Very small. Because we weren't really afraid of anything.
Because that terrorism and stuff didn't happen.
The only thing I remember being afraid of, and that was indoctrinated by my parents, were the communists. And it was like, the commies are going to take over.
And they've tried.
And they've tried. But
That was so, Red Scare was the 30s, but did you experience anything of McCarthy?
No.
I should have asked about that.
No.
You weren't
No,
there for the
McCarthy.
McCarthy era? Okay. But you guys are still instilled a sense of anti-communism.
Very
This is a
anti-communistic.
bad thing,
Because,
necessarily.
again, no, well, you got to remember Vietnam was cranking up. And with North and South Vietnam, and see, that was communist infiltration,
And we're supporters of South Vietnam.
we were supporters of South Vietnam, and
then we had the hippie movement.
you had the
Did you experience that, the hippie movement?
Oh, yes. I had an uncle that was part of the Grateful Dead. He followed the Grateful Dead. He was a Deadhead. Oh, yeah. He was at Woodstock. I have an uncle that's not but like 5 years older than me. And that was an interesting story. My grandmother...
So he was liberal or progressive?
My grandmother didn't know she was pregnant. She thought she had a kidney stone, went to the hospital and had a 4-pound baby, who was my uncle who slept in a shoebox in their house because my dad, again, go back to my dad, they didn't have a lot of money when he was growing up. So anyway, my uncle, he was the baby of the family, and still is to this day, just radical. He's a pot-smoking, he's trying to legalize pot all over the United States, very outspoken.
Liberal, very liberal.
Liberal does not even describe him. He's so funny.
What, almost communist?
No, not that far,
okay.
but he is very liberal.
Okay.
He still has long hair and a ponytail, and
So it's very different for your family because your family is mostly conservative.
oh yes,
See, these are the odd things that he, like, any odd things like that he wants me to focus on, and that's like, that's
he's still
interesting.
smoking dope. He had been arrested some. Oh yeah, he's in one of the characters in the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. He's one of the characters in that book.
Like, you mean somebody actually based it off of him? Or you mean like you're comparing it to him?
No, he is one of the characters in the book.
Really?
Oh
I'll
yeah,
do some research
and he's named. Now he's a very minor role,
But
very
he's still
minor
in
role.
the book.
But he's yeah.
So you have a relative that's in a book.
Not a very good book, but yes,
That is an interesting fact. you see?
it's fascinating. We love him for who he is. Well,
He's just-
I love him for who he
He's
is.
just eccentric.
My mother, of course, being the ultra conservative, would always go, I don't want her to hang out with him.
Okay.
So it was just very interesting, yes. So we had firsthand exposure to the whole hippie movement through Uncle Joe.
I didn't even, we got off top subject of the economic expansions of that.
Let me go back to the economic.
That's probably going to cover some of the stuff in here,
Okay.
too, so it's fine. And that's more stuff for me to write with, so
Okay.
don't worry about it. So what did you see necessarily with Reagan? What did you guys experience? How big of a boom, I guess, was it?
Oh,
What were you guys, like, I guess, what were you able to buy? Prices went down, anything. What do you remember?
well, by then we're talking college. And my
Okay.
parents paid for my college education because Daddy saved everything to pay for my college education.
So you went from being a lower to maybe
As he
middle
moved
class.
up with the railroad, he ended up, he finished his career with the railroad as a, gosh, what was he called? He was in the claims department and he worked with the legal team in fatality claim. So he would go out and investigate where people had gotten run over by the trains,
Okay.
which used to be a really big thing. It's not so much anymore. He would investigate those things, those accidents, testify in court, like an expert witness kind of thing. So as his role, I watched him finish his college degree. That was a huge impact. When we were in Chattanooga, I was in middle school again, or junior high, 7th grade, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. I watched him go to the University of Tennessee at night while he worked full-time and finished that degree, so he had a 4-year degree, first one in his family.
And what year was that?
That would have, I'm not sure.
Give me an estimate. That
Kelly was 65. I would put that 5 more years, maybe 70,
1970.
roughly.
I'll put a S.
And that was a huge deal. I remember all of his brothers came up there to see him graduate. His mother and father came to see him graduate. Of course, we were all there. But I can still see pictures in my mind of him sitting at the dining room table at night, trying to do schoolwork and juggle, because he had a lot of investigative work for the railroad, so he was doing work and schoolwork, and I think that's where all my work ethic came from, is watching that process and living that with him.
And that gives you a lot of firsthand experience.
The value of education.
There's
There
so
you
much.
go. The value of
I don't think
education.
we can do all this.
Don't worry about it.
We can have one more interview.
That's cool.
Next Monday before, I think I have to have it by Friday.
Okay.
I think that's the day it would be due, so. So what would you say you ended up like? By your college year, what class would you guys say you're in? Were you upper middle class? You're starting to be a little bit richer? I don't want to say that. Were you guys able to, you didn't have to scrape every penny to get by?
We were still doing, because of college. I'd say middle class.
So you pretty
Just
much stayed
plain
the
old
same.
middle class.
You never really, your parents never really went up. Okay.
If they did, they didn't tell me. They
Okay.
still behaved.
So as far stated, as far as you know, no, that stayed middle class. Got it. Started lower, went to middle.
Went to middle
and stayed
and just
consistently
stayed
middle.
there.
Okay. Did you ever move from the country to the city? And if not, don't worry about it. That's just, if you did, we need to know about that. It's migration.
I was never in the country. I was
So,
always in the
a city. Okay. Were your parents ever in the country?
My mother would have been, yes, because her family lived in Brooklet outside of Savannah, and they
Is
had
that a rural country farming
they had
area?
cotton and
Okay, so
that whole.
she definitely came from a farming background, which
Oh,
would-
yeah.
That's actually probably what the Sun Belt boom, which would have been after the World War II. So, was she with your father during World War II, or did they meet after? When were they together? Do you know?
I need to find that out. I don't know.
Okay.
I can't even remember when they were. I was thinking one of them was born in 35. What would that make them? About 8. My mom's 82 right now, so whatever.
Okay. From the Civil War into World War II, the average Southerner, white or black, was poorer, less educated, more likely to live in the rural area than other Americans. Many non-Southerners looked down upon them. The period of sustained economic growth around 1940 transformed the South and allowed it to almost catch up with the rest of the nation. If your subject moved to the South, it's certainly possible this was a direct result of the Sun Belt boom. Please place your subject in the social context of the area when speaking of class. So you didn't move. You stayed in the city. You were born in the city and stayed in the city.
Savannah, Cincinnati,
Okay.
Chattanooga, Rock Hill's the smallest place I've ever lived,
But it's still a city.
which is still the city.
Okay. Someone who recalls being poor during the Depression may be, okay, no, that's not about you. Also, many people see themselves as middle class when they were young, when they were actually poor, working class. I'm pretty sure he said you couldn't have been a working class if your mom was stay at home. That's a luxury you can't afford.
we were not a poor working class.
You were at least lower middle class. Okay, that is accurate. Because
There
he said a lot of people would be like, yeah, I was middle class, but they weren't.
No,
Because you owned a radio and a fridge and an oven, as you said. You
Yeah.
wouldn't. Okay. Lower.
We made a lot of sacrifices, but we had those.
Okay. If your subject lived in the South, this is where we're getting to race, so this might be a little, I don't know.
Oh, that's no big deal.
Oh, okay.
We can do race.
Daily life in racial segregated society and the changes wrought by desegregation in clearly significant topics. If your subject is African American, okay, not. For instance, what daily humiliations and aggravations? So it's asking if you were black, but you're not. Did you see any African American people humiliated, aggravated by Jim Crow? It says what specific strategies did he or she use to cope with them. What did you do whenever you saw this kind of stuff?
I was very sensitive, and it upset me to the point that it totally impacted what I do today. I used to go with my grandma into the projects in Savannah and do backyard Bible clubs with the black children. This would have been in 1965 to 1971. And it always upset me, and I never understood why they were separate and why they were different and why it was a big deal. I was the only white child in there. It bothered me that they didn't know how to read. It bothered me that nobody wanted to go to church with them. She was a church planter and a teacher. She's actually in Who's Who in the United Methodist Church because she planted a church in that area for African American children and their families, small church. And through those backyard Bible clubs and what I witnessed her doing and the love, the unconditional love that she showed, and the need to make a difference. She always talked to me about making a difference, leaving a legacy, making the world better than it was when you came into it. Because of all that, I chose to be a teacher. And when I chose to be a teacher, I chose to work only with children from poverty. And my entire career for 30 years has been devoted especially to African American males because I saw so much injustice with those boys and how the mothers would treat their own mothers, would treat them almost like they were stupid sometimes, but yet they would push and encourage their daughters. And that always made me mad. I never understood that. So basically, those experiences with race. Now, I went through the whole thing where we would get on the bus and the black people would be sitting in a different part of the bus. I went through all that, and that made me mad too. But to see it done to children, and I was a child the same age, made it even more wrong. It's exactly right. And that had such a huge impression on me. I have literally fought and sacrificed my whole career so that I could do something to keep that from happening to somebody. And I always kept feeling if there was just one, if I could just say just one. And that's why it breaks my heart so much when I see former students of mine that I have just poured and poured and poured and poured everything into end up getting arrested and making those bad choices. But then on the other hand, I can point to just as many or more, far more, where it has made a difference. And they did not end up going by the wayside. But that's a whole lot. I don't know where all that forms or fits.
That's perfect.
But watching that, people have asked me my whole life, you are a white woman. Why are you so worried about these black children?
And that's very odd because your family was Southern conservative, which is always stereotyped against black people. Segregation's a good thing.
And I watched people make fun of my grandmama because she